Hi guys, today going to be looking at turning some old failed resin prints into some statues. So you fairly often get failed prints where they pull away from supports, or you get weird lines running through them, or some parts are malformed. And these are very easily turned into either ruined or intact statues. So be very careful with this part. I'm wrapping it in a plastic bag and an old t-shirt, and then I'm getting my trusty rubber mallet. And be very careful when using resin, it can shatter and become very sharp, which is why you need to double wrap it, if not triple wrap it. But now we have several nice pieces we can use for a crumbling statue. And this one's going to be partly submerged into the ground, and you can see where it's splintered and there are some sharp edges. And we're then going to get rid of all the small pieces and the small shards. Then we're going to use some foam core and make some bases. So these are going to be simple ovals, and we're going to bevel the edge so we don't get any of that sharp top side coming through. And then just double check the sizing, making sure you've got enough room. For the second one, we're going to mount it on a base so it looks like it's got a small plinth underneath it. And this one failed where the weapon had fallen off at the end. And the final one we're just going to mount on its feet. And if anybody's curious, these were Titan Forge miniatures from their STL Patreon. And we're just going to go around and connect everything to the base using hot glue. I prefer using hot glue at this stage because it's easier to pull stuff off and reposition it if you don't like it. And we're just going to take the different pieces and glue them around the statue where it's fallen over and they've splintered off. Next we're going to mix up a basing paste, and this is going to be a mixture of cork, fine cork, PVA and black gesso. But you can really throw anything you want into these basing pastes, and they'll generally be fine. And give it a good stir together. We're then going to apply this all over the base, and where there's any gaps that we want to fill in, we can use that, and this is just going to be a nice thick mud that's going to be all around the base of the statues. And you can overlap as much of the statue as you want, depending on how sunken you want it to be. And also make sure you do the edge of the base, because you don't want that top layer of the foam core showing through, because that will be picked up by a dry brush quite clearly. And if you go too heavy, you can scrape off and show a bit more of the underlying structure. Then, grabbing some small aquarium rocks, we're just going to poke them in while the basing grit is still damp and wet. Then we are going to prime the miniatures. So using some Vallejo surface primer, we're just going to go in and coat the models and the rocks on the base. And once that's dry, we're going to go in with a light grey and give the entire statue a nice grey coat. These are AK Interactive paints I'm using, but I do use some P3 paints later on. And I find to get a slightly more natural rock look, give it a slightly uneven coating, because then you get some of the kind of natural variance within the rock. And while you've got the grey out, also do the pebbles on the base as well. And for the last statue, we're going to make it metallic instead of stone. So with some bronze colour, we're going to go in and give a heavy dry brush all over. Next, moving on to the bases, we're going to use a mid-tone brown, and we're going to give the entire thing a base coat of brown. And don't worry if you overlap the rocks a little bit, that will be covered up later. Then, using our same brown, we're going to mix in some white paint and make a pale sand colour, and give a dry brush over all the brown, as well as the rocks on the base. And this will just tie them all together a bit. And again, it doesn't matter if you hit the actual statue a bit, it will probably add to the effect. We're then going to add a bit more detail to the statues. So with a watered down turquoise, going to give a patina on the bronze statue. And you just want it to go into the recesses, and you don't want any kind of clear blocks of turquoise. And here using a P3 privateer press paints for this. And then doing the same for the stone statues, but with a green. And we just wanted to go into the recesses and tint the model a bit. Next, we're going to grind up some clump foliage until it's quite fine. Then we're going to mix that clump foliage with some PVA and apply it as a sort of heavy moss and overgrowth onto the statues. And I want it to be kind of climbing up and growing over the statues. And I mixed up a second batch, but I used a bit too much PVA, and it came out a bit too glossy and smooth. But you can get over that by adding another layer of clump foliage on top of the PVA. Would probably be best to do that while it's still wet, which I did not do. Then we're going to add a few leaves, so just crimping them slightly and adding them strategically around the base. Then, once that's dry, to get rid of some of the glossiness where the PVA overlapped, we're just going to go in with the same stone colour and go over where the PVA is not being covered by the foliage. And you could also use a matte dull coat for the same effect. And to dull down the sheen of the foliage a bit and give it a bit more depth, just going to take some of the green paint, same I used for the tinting earlier, and just dab that on the top of the foliage. And that will give it some colour depth, as well as knocking back some of the glossiness to it. And you can also blend it into the rock a bit, where you have that kind of extra fine moss. Then, going in with some PVA, going to apply some static grass to the base. So just, again, strategically dabbing around the edge, and not using too much PVA, and using a kind of mossy coloured static grass here. And there we have it, some failed resin prints turned into broken statues. And you can really just use the kind of overgrown foliage to cover up all the failed mould lines and where it's come loose in the supports. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch you next week.